Fidel Castro said a revolution is a struggle to the death between the future and the past. And that's exactly what we get on this album, an album judged by many to be one of the band's weakest. But is it really that bad? Welcome classic rock fans to a video where we discuss the Rolling Stones' 17th studio album, Undercover. If you haven't already done so, please do click like, subscribe, and do check that notification bell. This album has sold well, but behind the scenes there was this titanic tug of war going on between Jagger and Richards over the very identity and soul of this band. Jagger's ambitious vision for this band involved more leg warmers and dance beats, whereas Richards clung rather stubbornly to the band's core blues roots. Nevertheless, I would argue there are some stunning Stonesy moments on this record, despite Jagger's desire to explore the contemporary musical trends of the day. I mean, this is a much maligned album, but in all fairness, a lot of those legacy bands from the 60s and 70s that tried to embrace the musical tropes of the 1980s didn't fare that well, often seen as a cynical ploy to muscle in on new markets and to win the hearts and minds of the then generation. Often these groups would find that their newfound direction just did not suit their core sound and core fan base. But even the Stones themselves have distanced themselves from this record, seeing it as a reminder of the breakdown in that Jagger-Richards songwriting axiom, as well as a grim reminder of Watts and Wood's own alcohol and substance abuses. Bill Wyman, of course, at this juncture was probably out attending the birth of his future wife. As I said before, Keith Richards was keen to keep the band firmly rooted within the paradigms of that classic blues rock synthesis that they did so well, whereas Jagger wanted the group to be relevant, which included dipping his toes into the tepid waters of dance and funk, less street fighting man and more Saturday Night Fever. Interestingly, in an interview that Richards did for Life magazine, he said, "Mick's taste in music had often changed quite drastically. He wanted to lay on me the latest hit he'd heard. At a time when we were doing Undercover in 1983, he was just trying to out-disco everybody. Mick was chasing musical fashion. A direction, of course, that would transmogrify horribly into the Dirty Work album, which came out a few years later. But one can see both sides of the coin here. Often artists can run the risk of becoming rather staid and predictable, yet at the same time, by attempting to explore different avenues or wanting to be more contemporary, they lose all kind of artistic integrity, just becoming a pale facsimile of a sound that just isn't theirs. And many bands have paid the price of alienating their core audience. It's a fine line, and in the context of the Rolling Stones, I use the term line advisedly. And it's true, of course, that Jagger had largely assumed control of this band in the 70s. He loomed over the proceedings like a huge Dayglow suit wearing Cheshire Cat, especially post-exile, understandably so given Richards being somewhat indisposed. But there was a bristling sense of unease amongst the other Stones members who felt they were just kind of mere hirelings in the Mick Jagger band. And tension forms a very nuclei of this album. Interestingly, in the video Undercover, we have Jagger being murdered horribly by Richards with a machine gun, art imitating life perhaps, but also other songs as well belies this aggression, violence, informing the writing subconsciously or unconsciously. Violent lyrics abound on this record, like songs like It Must Be Hell, Tie You Up, The Pain of Love, Pretty Beat Up. Bugger me, it's an angry album. But to understand this album, we've got to consider, as I said, the musical topography of the time and the Stones' entry into the 1980s. Emotional Rescue, it came out in 1980, but it was an album largely recorded in 1979. So by the time we do get to the 80s, we get Tattoo You, which is an album that's made up of a bit of a jigsaw of a record, really, made up of offcuts harvested together from their 70s records. Still Life was a live album made up of classic cuts and covers recorded in concert. So this, in many respects, is the band's attempt at fresh material in a decade that just didn't resemble the 60s and 70s, where this band had so efficiently and effectively cut their teeth. Disco may well have been on its way out at this time, but nevertheless pop and dance trends were apparent. The pallid heroin chic of the New Romantics had replaced the spit and rage of the punk movement, and the burgeoning influence of those synthetic elements were palpable. And that's lest we forget the impact of Michael Jackson's Thriller, which came out around about 1982. Many believe that Richards saved this album, and that it was Richards' belligerence and loyalty to the band's core sound that stopped it veering off too much into pop territory, away from the Stones' time-honoured minimalistic rock and roll. But I really like this record. It actually features one of my 10 most loved Stones albums. It has some great moments on this record, I feel, as well. I think Richards brought an interesting sound to this record, almost pastiche of 50s rock and roll in tracks like I Wanna Hold You, where he takes the lead vocal, of course, but also, more importantly, She Was Hot. And despite that conflict between Jagger and Richards, it yielded some wonderful material, even the more experimental stuff. For example, the grit and energy volunteered in the chorus section of the horror-themed Too Much Blood is just absolutely fabulous. It's a song that presents that reimagined sonic aesthetic for this group. Ronnie Wood contributes, I think, to one track on this album, Pretty Beat Up, which sounds very much like it could be lifted from 1976's Black and Blue. And I just love Undercover of the Night with its fiery funk beat, which pretty much establishes this as a Jagger piece, I think. The lyrics deal with political corruption in South America, but the rhythm section on this is fabulous, which is down to Sly Dunbar and Robbie Shakespeare. Shakespeare replaces Bill Wyman on this one, and this sporadic bass playing adds to the overall nervousness and that sense of paranoid unease. Also, the very dub echo of Dunbar's electric drums works perfectly with Watt's consistent backbeat here. Certainly making this, rooting this in the sonic landscape of the time. And Too Much Blood is fabulous. It's a very warped look at popular culture in the 1980s, with its mutant disco beat over Mick Jagger attempts some half-assed rapping. But it works fabulously, with Jagger referencing the Texas Chainsaw Massacre and lots of other nasty stuff. And there are other tracks on this album, like All the Way Down and the quite rowdy Too Tough, which sounds to me as they could be lifted from the 1970s, as well as Richard's rather jittery riffing, announcing quite a poppy tune, in fact, I Wanna Hold You. But this in itself serves as a kind of breath of fresh air, welcome relief from the blood and guts going on elsewhere on this record. It's a much needed exhalation amid the rather taut topography that defines this record. In the extended narrative that is the Rolling Stones, many will argue, and will argue in the comments below, that this is a dreadful album and indeed a misstep. But I absolutely adore it. I really do enjoy it, and my hope is that we'll get a deluxe edition of this one day. Do you remember the Rewind video, VHS video, which had starred Jagger and Bill Wyman going through some of their classic iconic hits? I had that. That came out about this time. Some great pop videos were made for this album. She Was Hot is wonderful. Of course, Undercover of the Night, all that could be included. And I also believe there are hours and hours of outtakes. So I would love to see a nice deluxe edition with that wonderful artwork reproduced to honour this very much maligned Stones album. Anyway, what do you think? Am I barking up the wrong tree here or what? Please leave your comments below. I'd love to hear from you. But other than that, stay well, stay healthy. But more importantly than that, of course, is you keep listening.